because most all the young people always sat in the back. But my mom and dad always said you can't follow the Lord afar off. If you're going to church, you need to sit up front, because that's up front is where the worship is, and you can't sit in the back. And they didn't. They always said, we don't want to hear of you sitting in the back of the church on the back seats with those kids who cut up. We want you up front. So I always went up front, and I still do today. Closest front. But anyway, he came in and sat by the side of me. But little did I know that was his granddaddy that was sitting on the front seat, that was chairman of deacons. And his grandma was sitting right behind us. But several Sunday nights he would come and say, can I sit with you tonight? And he'd come in and sit with me. That went on for a good long while, maybe a couple months or so. Finally one night he said, well, could I walk you home? It wasn't very far. I would say about probably 3 blocks. I said, yes, I guess. So he walked me home, said good night, and rushed as fast as he could to catch the ones that were going up the other way, up the hill to where he lived. And that's the way it began. And we were married 64 years when he passed away. He had a stroke and was in the Veterans Hospital.
What year did you get married, and how old were you?
Well, we got married in 1932 in the Depression. Imagine getting married in the Depression. And he would go and work in the coal mines, Bob. I remember him working in the coal mines for 12 hours and making $2.64. You didn't make much money back there then. I don't know how people survived. But it was during the Depression, and there was soup lines everywhere and all. But my family never went hungry because my dad always raised the garden and he knew how to manage it. And we never went hungry. But I was 15, and when he decided we ought to get married, he said, he asked me if I would marry him, and I said yes. He said, well, I think we ought to talk it over with your dad. I said, we better. So he was invited to dinner one Sunday. We were sitting at the dinner table. And Seth said, Mr. Vandall, I want to ask you a question. Can your daughter and me get married? My dad laid his fork down and his knife down. He said, Lord, no, she's too young. And my dad and Seth had been working in the woods some together that summer. I don't know why Seth was working in the woods. They were cutting timber, but he was. And he and Dad were working on the same job. And Dad said, no, she's too young. And so after that, Seth said to me, he said, well, I think we need to get married. Let's run off. Get married. I said, run off? He said, yes. We can only go up here to the church on Sunday and get the preacher to come down to the house next to the church and marry us. But he said, I'll need to go down there and talk to them people. They were Dixons. Their name was Dixon. And I had been babysitting their son some. They went somewhere at night. They'd always call Mom and Dad, ask if I could come up and sit with their son while they were gone 2 or 3 hours. And I'd been babysitting their son. Oh, I guess he was about 7 or 8 years old then. So Seth went down there and asked him if we could get married in their living room. I'm trying to think of the preacher's name. I know it well, but it won't come to me right now. And then they said yes, and so he went and talked to the preacher, and the preacher said yes. and we were going to keep it a secret for a year. And so this Sunday morning, we called it eloping. We left the house, and Mom and Dad could see from their kitchen window the church. They saw, and Mom always watched to see if we got up there and went into church. If for some strange reason that Sunday morning she didn't see us go into church, we went down to the Dixon's house, just right below the church, and got married. And we told the preacher how we were keeping it a secret for a year. He came right out, and some of my best friends were standing around in the yard up there. And he came right out of that house and walked up through past them. He said, "Well, I just married a couple." And they saw me and Seth come out of that house. And Oscar Richard, he really liked me because I helped him with his schoolwork a lot in school. And it kind of upset him. And there was a filling station right out just from the house where we lived. And a lot of the evenings, there'd be guys gathered out there to just sit around and talk and all. And sometimes Dad would gather out there with them. That Sunday evening, they all gathered out there. And Oscar went up to my dad and said, "Did you know your daughter got married this morning?" He said, "No." He said, "Well, she sure did." And my dad broke down and come to the house crying, and he cried like he was going to die. But then he got over it, because we had kind of had 3 years before that, we had had a tragic thing happen in our family when Mom and Dad's only son and my only brother died. He was 23 years old, and he became ill with typhoid fever. And they couldn't save him, and he died, and that left a hole in our family. I think it left a hole in my mom's and dad's life and left one in mine. And I think we were looking for some way to fill that hole. And since my dad already knew Seth before, somehow or the other he was able to accept it. And he always treated him really good, and always, somehow or the other, accepted him as a son himself. And I think that really it was a miracle in one sense of the way, because in the scripture it says God will place a solitary person in a family. And Seth had a hard time as a child growing up after his mother died. His mother died when he was 9 years old. And he was born between two daughters. For some strange reason, his father was really mean to him. He was mean to him, desperately mean, violently mean to him. He was telling me one time about when his stepmother and the other kids were gone off, that his daddy tied him up, drove a stake in the ground, and tied him up with a chain to that stake, and kept him chained up there about a half a day, and poured a bowl of water and set it out there for him. Took a hunk of cornbread and threw it out there to him. Said, here's you some food and water. And when Mary came home that evening and saw what was going on, she threw a fit and was going to call the law, and he went out there and got Seth loose from that. But that's just a little example, because he went through lots of real violence. Oh, one day he was sitting at the table eating. It was lunchtime, and Granddad always went to work in the afternoon shift.